Hello and welcome back to this web series on System Center Operations Manager 2012 R2 covering installation and configuration. My name is Daniel Queen and you are watching part 3 where we're going to go over installing and configuring SQL Server 2012 Service Pack 1. Now, one quick design consideration in your environment. Normally in a production environment I would actually give the two main databases, the operational database and the data warehouse database, their own dedicated servers, but for the purposes of this lab I'm going to combine the two of them on a single server sharing the default instance. Now whether you choose the default instance or a named instance will just depend on what's the norm in your environment and slightly modifies which SQL ports you'll need. We're going to go over actually the entire install of the SQL Server itself with all the configuration options. And we're going to go over opening the firewall ports in Windows Firewall. Here's a quick slide, real quick, showing you which ports for reference. For the normal SQL ports, 1433 TCP if you're using the default instance, or 1434 TCP for a named instance. There are a few gotcha ports that are not actually really documented in the SCOM documentation anywhere, although they could be in some SQL documentation somewhere, and any SQL DBA could probably sniff these out for you, or you could if you're industrious with your firewall logs. But UDP 137 and TCP 135, 445 in the dynamic range, and I'll actually get to explaining those further down in this section, but this is just a quick reference card for you to look back at, because especially those RPC ports, a lot of people get stuck right there, especially if you're using Windows Firewall or you have a restrictive firewall and these aren't already open for you. So this is a quick way to reference back, and I'll explain those when we get there. So let's go ahead and dive right on in. Okay, so I am here logged into my SQL Server SQL01.xlab.com, and let's go ahead and install SQL Server. Now, as you'll see here, I just have a single extra drive in here, a 50 gig drive to house my SQL data. In a real production environment, you would, have this built out with a lot more best practices in mind. This is just going to get me through this lab, as I'm not going to have really any data to speak of housed in these databases. On that note, also, there are Microsoft documents out there detailing how big to make your databases and how to spec your servers. There's a sizing tool out there that you can download. It runs in Excel, and you punch in some numbers and it spits out some good specs. That being said, even my server specs here in this lab are not really what you'd find out in the real world. So in case you're wondering, most of these just have a single CPU. I think my SCOM server has a couple gigs of memory. This one only has 4 gigs. Most of the rest of mine are only running a gig of memory. So it's running very slim because I'm not really doing anything in this environment. So I need to, one second, I need to mount my CD real quick. I had to restore this image because I goofed in an earlier video. So if you'll give me one moment. Okay, there we go. Also, one other thing to note, the SQL Server installer has a lot of long pauses in there, so I won't subject you to having to wait through those. I'm going to probably pause this video off and on in case you're wondering why there's going to be some time jumps, just to save you from having to wait through all this. Okay, I'm here at the SQL Server Installation Center. I'm going to click on Installation and then New SQL Server Standalone Installation. Okay, we're at our first prerequisite checker here. All these should pass. If you haven't already installed, .NET 3 on your server, you probably want to do that before you start. But all of these should pass okay. Okay, and we have all pass. Okay, for the next part of our setup, I'm going to be using the evaluation version. So click Next. Accept the license terms. Next. I don't have internet connectivity here in my lab, that's why I'm receiving this error, so that's okay. I already have the minimum version of SQL Server for this environment, so I'm okay with that. Next, setup files are being installed. Okay, we're at another prerequisite checker. Now on this one, I am going to get warnings for the last two. The first one is just because I don't have internet access, and so it can't check if this is correct or not. The second part, I am actually running all my servers with Windows Firewall enabled. Now in your particular setup, this may not be the case, and if it's not the case and you just end up turning it off, then you're going to save a little bit of headache later on when we go to configure the firewall ports for this. There are a couple extra firewall ports that Microsoft doesn't really document that you need, and a lot of people seem to run into problems with. I'm going to go ahead and keep Windows Firewall on just so I can show you those little extra tricky ports. So we're going to click Next here. I'm going to do a SQL Server feature installation. New database engine services, you must do full text and semantic extractions for search. So we're going to check that. Now, as I said before, I'm going to throw this quick note in here. I am combining all of my major databases on one server. If you did separate servers, you need full text and semantic extractions on both. Now, I'm not going to do reporting services here because I am going to actually put reporting services on another computer and maybe just house the database here. If I change my mind later, I can always go back and add this feature later. So I'm just going to leave it off for now. And I do want the management tools. So I'm going to click Next. And we're going to wait for a little bit. Okay, our next prerequisites. There's a lot of prerequisite checking in this. So we're going to click Next. Now, you could do a named instance, and that's fine and dandy. You don't have to. If you wanted to put this on a higher port or whatever, you could do that. I'm going to do a default instance here just so I can stick with the normal ports. If this was on even if these were on separate servers, you could do named instances, which isn't a half bad idea. I just don't want to in this case. So I'm going to use default instance just to make things easy for myself. Leave just the standard instance ID of MS SQL Server. Click Next. Okay, my disk space is okay. Click Next again. Okay, now we are here to our account setup. Like I said, I'm going to use domain accounts for these rather than the built-ins. So I'm going to go ahead and add these in here. So xlab/svc_server. Now for SQL Server Agent, you're going to set the startup type to automatic. And I guess I could have created separate accounts for all these different services, which sometimes I'll do. In this case, I did not. Okay, and that's all we need to do for now. If you go over to the Collation tab here, in order for everything to work properly, this must, and I repeat, must be set to SQL_Latin1_General_CPI_CI_AS. It must be set to this. So if it's not, if you're, say, if you're installing it under a different language, it still has to be this. Even if you're installing under Spanish language, or whatever, it must be this. So it almost always is, but make sure it is. Okay. So that's all good. If you did install reporting services here, you would enter the same account credentials for reporting services. Under server configuration, I'm just going to add myself as a SQL Server Administrator. This is going to be required a little bit later when we actually set up the management server. You have to be whatever account you are doing the management server setup as, you also need to be a SQL Server Administrator. So just keep that in mind. My data directories, I have that extra hard drive, so I'm just going to set everything here. Like I said, in a real production scenario, you would set this up differently, probably temp DB on a different drive and so on and so forth. File stream, that should be just fine. So next, another prerequisite. Oh, I did not want that. There we go. That's all fine. and it's asking if I'm ready to install. I'm going to click install, and I'll pause this recording while it installs. One more thing I'll mention while this is installing. I know that I said that you need to be a SQL Server administrator for the management server installation phase. Well, really, when you set up your first management server, it's going to configure and create the databases and things like that. If in your environment you have SQL DBAs that don't want to give out privileges, typically they'll be okay giving you administrator privileges, at least for the duration of the install. It's kind of one of those, well, they can give you administrator or you can make them an administrator. Someone's got to perform the install. Afterwards, you do not have to be an administrator. It is strictly for the installation part of it. I thought I would just make note of that for you. Although, I did just remember there is one other little caveat to that. Later on, when we are installing the gateway server, there is a specific tool that we will be running called the Gateway Approval tool. What this tool is actually doing in the background is it is going through and making some database modifications. So you will actually need to be a database administrator when you are installing a gateway server as well. Now in this case, we'll be creating our gateway server pretty soon after we create the main components of the environment. But say if your organization is expanding or creating new domains or things like that, you might be creating more gateway servers after you have created the core of the environment. So keep that in mind. You might want to keep your SQL DBAs in the loop, and just so that they won't get too uncomfortable giving you the access you need when you need to do installations. Okay, so we have completed our SQL Server 2012 SP1 installation. So now let's go ahead and dive in real quick and do our firewall port openings that we are going to need. Okay, I do have a group policy here that's just opening up ICMP ping because it's not really opened up by default. So, like I said before, you may have an external firewall, you may not be using Windows Firewall, but in the event that you are, these are the rules you're going to need. So I'm going to create a new rule, a new port rule. TCP, I need to do 1433. This is going to be my main SQL communication port. I'm going to allow, I mean, I guess you could do all. I'm on a domain, so I'm just going to do domain name. I'm going to do SQL port 1433. And this is my basic SQL port that I'm going to need. Okay, so that's that. Now we are going to need a few ports open for RPC, because when we do our management server install, it's going to be contacting the SQL server to find out some information about the server and the installation, things like that. That's the part that they don't typically tell you that you actually need open, and you will get some failures when we do our management server installs if we do not have these open. And I'll actually probably create this rule and then disable it later on when we do the management server installation, just so you can see what the error looks like. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and show you the extra little tricky ports that Microsoft doesn't really tell you about in the Operations Manager documentation. This stuff is probably easily found out by your SQL DBAs, and some of these may not be applicable to your situation, but this is the minimum amount of extra port rules that I found works for installing this. So let's go ahead and do this. Here I'm on XL SQL01, my SQL server. Now in addition to my port 1433, which I need all the time for the default instance, I need to create a couple temporary rules. Now in my experience, you can remove these after installation. So if that makes your DBAs happy, you can do that. So my first one I need is a port opening for UDP 137. allow the connection. I'm going to allow it on the domain. Like I said, you could do all three if you wanted to. I'm going to call this one SCOM SQL temp UDP ports. Okay. And the second one, we're going to do our TCP openings. Now, for this one, you for sure need TCP 135 and 445. Now, for the next port, I've found that if I use one somewhere in the SQL high dynamic port range, it will work. I've used typically 49154, it seems to work. If you do punch in like 49154, it takes a little bit longer, and if you check your firewall logs, you'll see that it's trying on a couple of the ports. It seems like it tries like a few random different ones to speak. Basically, SCOM is trying to talk on one of the dynamic SQL ports. I'm not really sure why it's doing that, but if you don't enable one of those ports, you will get an error when trying to install the first management server. When it tries to configure the databases, it will say that it cannot figure out what version of SQL you're running. So like I said, I found if it makes it easier, I've tried 49154 and it works. It takes a little bit longer, and you definitely see some chatter in your firewall logs for dropped packets. The fastest way possible is to go ahead and enable the entire range, which is 49.152 through 65.535. And like I said, you can remove these when you're done if your DBAs are a little unsure about opening this range up. We're going to allow the connection on the domain, and we're going to call this one SCOM SQL. What did I name the other ones? Temp TCP ports. Okay, and these will be our temporary ones while we do the installation, and afterwards you can remove these. So that should complete our SQL Server install and configuration portion of this web series. So in part 4, we will be actually running our first SCOM component installation for the first management server and configuring the databases themselves. So until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next part.